Probably the only time that people living in Middle Tennessee see fir trees is when they go to the Christmas tree section of Lowe's or Home Depot in December and see the cut firs for sale. Usually there'll be balsam fir and Douglas fir there. But there are some fir species that will grow in Middle Tennessee. And let's take a look at those. But before we start down the list, I will say that in general, all of the firs are relatively hard to obtain. But so far I've been pretty fortunate in growing them. They seem to do pretty well. So number one on the list, if you want to have a fir in Middle Tennessee, you should try to obtain this one. The Latin name is abies firma, and you could call it Japanese fir, but a more common name is Momi Fir, M-O-M-I. Native to Japan, and it grows at lower elevations in Japan, which is important because this species has better tolerance for heat and humidity, and especially the roots are more tolerant of heat and clay soils. So this species is used as rootstock for a lot of other grafted firs. I think forestfarm.com may have this, and every now and then a few other online sources will have it. But if you want to try to grow a fir in Tennessee, I recommend Momi Fir, abies firma, above all others. And this one is pretty large. It must be about, I don't know, 10 feet tall, probably. Put on a lot of vertical growth this summer. You can see that vertical leader up there is over a foot long, and that's how you measure the vertical growth for a single growing season. So it's doing pretty well. A close look at the foliage. It does have relatively sharp tips on the fir needles, and there's that characteristic fir needle method of attachment to the stem. Looks like little suction cups there. It's not fragrant, this species. Some fir species are known for being fragrant, but this one is not one of them. But it handles winter and summer very well here. Moving on. Another fir that would be relatively easy to obtain would be Concolor fir. This grows mainly in the western United States, and the Latin name is abies concolor. This particular specimen here is the blue cloak cultivar of Concolor fir, and it is grafted to the abies firma rootstock that I mentioned earlier. So only the top of this tree is Concolor fir. The roots are once again abies firma, Japanese fir. And this one put on a surprising amount of growth as well. That's a good 6 inches in the first summer it's been planted. I wasn't expecting that. You can see I do have it staked up because it doesn't have quite as much vertical tendency as I would like, but it has a pretty good branching pattern. So that's Concolor fir. Another fir that you can pretty regularly find online is the Spanish fir, Latin name abies pinsapo. And this is a pretty unique fir in that the needles are relatively short and thick, and it has kind of a weird geometric uniformity to the needles that give it an unusual texture. There are several different cultivars out there in the horticultural trade. This is the fastigiata or columnar variety, and it doesn't seem to have a very good central leader growth pattern, but we'll see. Maybe that will develop over time. Last year it put on pretty good growth. You can see that's maybe about 7 inches or so. This year the growth was less. I don't know if that was because of the drought and the heat or what, but for now it's nothing more than a bush really. There's a golden variety which I have not purchased because I also tried to buy the blue variety and that one died. So that was the only fir that I've lost. And so since then I've decided just to limit my Spanish fir to this one. And I'll see how it does. In general, I think that Mediterranean species usually don't do that well in Middle Tennessee because the climate is so different. So I've tried to focus more on like the Central Asia fir species or Eastern Asia or North America, if possible. Okay, here's an Asian fir. It's the Baishon Fir, abies beshanzuensis, and it comes from eastern China. At one time, this was one of the most endangered conifers on the planet, and this is grafted to Turkish fir rootstock. I got this from coniferkingdom.com. They may have a few left, but it put on a little bit of growth this summer. First year in the ground, and we'll see how it does over time. In theory, the top side should be pretty well adapted to our soil, and the Turkish fir rootstock has been grown in the eastern United States as well. And here's a different Turkish fir species. This is abies nordmanniana, or Nordmann Fir, which is actually sold in the Christmas tree trade in Europe a lot, as I understand it. This particular one is grafted onto abies firma rootstock, and I've got it staked up just a little bit because I think these were grafted branches, but it's growing with really good uniformity, fairly straight. You wouldn't know it's a grafted branch. You can see it has a pretty symmetric branching pattern, and it put on maybe 4 inches, 5 inches of growth this summer. Looks pretty healthy. It's actually been healthy the entire time I had it in the ground. And I think this one would be fairly easy to obtain from coniferkingdom.com as well. Nordmann Fir, grafted onto abies firma. That's actually a really great choice for Tennessee. And it, in some ways, is more attractive than the Japanese fir, just because it has probably a nicer needle structure, nicer branching structure. It seems to be slower growing than the Japanese fir, but maybe it makes up for it in attractiveness. So I definitely would recommend Nordmann Fir. Here's another fir. This is the Vejar Fir. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a fir native to northeastern Mexico. And I just planted it this year, and it put on about 9 inches of growth. This one has a bluish cast because this is the Blue Mountain cultivar, abies vejarii, grafted onto Turkish fir rootstock, and the particular Turkish fir is abies mulleriana. So we'll see how that one does. And by the way, this blue Mexican fir was purchased from coniferkingdom.com, and I think they still have some left, if you want them. Okay, in the category of firs that are nearly impossible to obtain, I have this one, abies homolepis, the Nikko Fir, also from Japan, but it grows at a higher elevation in Japan than the abies firma does. And I just happened to find this one relatively tall specimen. Check that out. It's way up there. At a local nursery in Middle Tennessee. It's a little bit of an experiment. It's actually kind of got a crack in the trunk. I'll show you. It was on sale, and there was only one. But you can see at some point in the past, the trunk had a split, and now it started to regrow very well to cover that up. And the branching is a little sparse in spots. It was like this when I got it. To me, it looks like a tree that had been in the pot for way too long and just needed to reestablish its roots, because it's actually grown quite well, retained needles pretty well, especially in the upper portion. As you can see, most of the growth is up there. So we'll see what Nikko Fir does. I have read online that it grows well in Tennessee, that there's some larger specimens planted somewhere in Middle Tennessee. I haven't tracked those down or even tried to track them down, but for this one here, in full sun, doing pretty well. Now here's the tree that's commonly called, or the common name is Chinese fir, or sometimes you see China fir, but it's actually not a true fir. As you may have noticed when I was mentioning the Latin names of all the other firs, the genus name for true fir is abies, but this is cunninghamia lanceolata, so the genus name is cunninghamia, and there's only one species in that genus, which is the lanceolata. And actually, you look at it really quickly, you can notice a lot of differences from true firs. The needles don't have that suction cup design attaching to the stem, rather they kind of branch off from the stem with this leafy appearance. They're extremely sharp, and just the growth structure itself is very different. You can see there's this very geometric branching pattern. And I've talked about cunninghamia lanceolata a lot, all of its pluses and minuses. This is the green variety. I'll show you the blue one. Here's the blue cunninghamia lanceolata. For some reason it looks especially blue in this light. This one seems to be harder to grow because it doesn't establish vertical growth as easily, so I've got it staked up. Same foliage texture though. Here's a different specimen of the blue, once again staked up to try to keep it growing straight. In general, they're kind of difficult to grow, but from a climate suitability standpoint, it's probably one of the more suited to this local hot, wet Tennessee climate. Although sometimes it does take frost damage in the early spring if it branches out too soon. Here's yet another example of that blue Chinese fir. This one put on about 9 or 10 inches of vertical growth this year. And you can find them online every now and then. I think Forest Farm may have had them. KeepingItGreenNursery.com may have had them at one point. And maybe places like Far Reaches or Oriental Garden Supply could have them every now and then. You'll just have to scour the internet to find them. It's not really a true fir though, but it can grow well in Tennessee if you're lucky.